So hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Marlene Sahakian, and with Claire Houlihan, we have the pleasure of co-chairing this series of talks on sustainable consumption and social change as part of the Future Earth Network systems of sustainable production and consumption. I think I got it. So we have the pleasure of introducing this morning Dan Welsh, who is a lecturer in sociology and researcher at the Sustainable Consumption Institute at the University of Manchester. His research focuses on intersections of consumption studies, sustainability, social change, social futures, and social theory. He's quite an active member of our network. Some of us who are part of the sociology community have seen, of course, his presentations at our different research network events or at the last European Sociological Association meeting. Unfortunately, because I missed Dan's talk, I'm even more happy to be here and have him with us here this morning. I should also say, with myself and Stefan Wallen, he's the co-editor of a new journal that will be launched in summer 2022 called Consumption and Society, where we hope social futures will play an important role. So Dan, thanks so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Marlene and Claire, for inviting me here today. It's very nice to see everybody and have the opportunity to talk about the project. So I'm talking today about a project called Futures of Consumption, which is funded by the UK's Economic and Social Research Council. It's been myself and my colleague Ulrika Ehrgartner, who's played a really fundamental role in developing the methodology that I'm going to talk about a bit later on in the presentation this morning. So I want to begin with these two pictures, which I'm going to talk about, because they represent to me two very important moments in the history of consumer society. So this first picture, the picture on the left, I can just, and this is where you discover that your slides aren't moving. Bear with me one moment. Sorry, I might have to stop my share and start it again. That's no good. There we go. Apologies. Okay, so this is a picture from 1959. This is the American home economist Anne Anderson, and she's demonstrating appliances and features in the RCA Whirlpool Miracle Kitchen of the Future. And this was a display. This is one of 4 kitchens in the American National Exhibition in Moscow in 1959. It's intriguingly in a sort of thaw in the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union exchanged national exhibitions. And this exhibition was a scene of what's become famous as the kitchen debate between then US Vice President Richard Nixon and the Soviet First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev, which was a debate begun not in this kitchen, but in another one of the kitchens in the American exhibition, a debate on the relative merits of US consumer capitalism and Soviet communism, and became very famous because it then carried on televised. If you're not familiar with the debate, it's worth Googling and having a look at the footage of it. It's fascinating. So for the US, this exhibition was seen as an opportunity to demonstrate the fruits of the capitalist American consumer market. This was at a point in time where the Soviets led in a number of technologies. Sputnik had been launched a couple of years before. Yuri Gagarin was going to be the first man in space in just a few months' time after this exhibition. So there was genuine technological rivalry at this point between Soviet communism and American capitalism. Where the US undoubtedly did have technological dominance, however, was in consumer goods and in the standards of living of a growing middle class. Hence the inclusion of not just 1, but 4 kitchens in the National Exhibition. And this particular kitchen that I'm interested in, the RCA Whirlpool Miracle Kitchen, purported to demonstrate the near future of technological advances, advances in consumption, advances in comfort and convenience. So this is an imagined future of consumption. And imagined futures of consumption, of course, have played a central role politically and economically since the end of the Second World War. Obviously taking the form of promises of prosperity for all, promises of ever-rising living standards realised through mass consumption in the consumer society. So I think to me, the RCA Whirlpool Miracle Kitchen is a perfect illustration of the ideological role that can be played by imagined futures of consumption, and how that was manifest in the post-war period, obviously critical for the origins of our consumer society. So this was the heyday of faith in the West, in the inextricable linkages of democracy, capitalism, consumer society, and technological progress. Moreover, this was a point in time where there was faith in what Susan Buck-Morss has referred to as mass utopia underlying both capitalist and communist political economies. So a shared faith in what she calls, quote, the faith that the industrial reshaping of the world is capable of bringing about the good society by providing material happiness for the masses. And latterly, of course, in consumer society, we see a big reconfiguration or mutation of this faith into a kind of privatized, individualized utopia. Today, of course, there's a profound crisis in the promises of imagined futures offered by consumer society. The political economic legitimacy of capitalist consumer society, founded on this promise of freedom, realized through the realm of leisure in mass consumption. So this is what Jens Becker describes with the term promissory legitimacy, to refer to, quote, future-orientated dimensions of the legitimacy of political and economic processes. So this second image is from 2008. It's from an American photographer called Brian Ulrich. It's a picture of a deserted shopping mall in the wake of the financial crisis. This is taken from a 10-year project of Ulrich's to map the rise and fall of the 20th century imaginary of American consumer culture. In the wake of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, there's been a profound loss of faith in the central promises of capitalist consumer society. And this is well documented by survey evidence internationally. It's quite variegated internationally, but it's a very noticeable. But the promise of ever-rising living standards, the promissory authority, if you like, of neoliberalism, any vestiges of the promises of the mass utopia that Buck-Morss identified have become exhausted. So this is a crisis in expectation, and of course that crisis in expectation is also bound up with, it's concomitant with the existential crisis presented by climate change, by ecological limits. And so this is a crisis, I think, to what Timothy Mitchell in his brilliant book Carbon Democracy calls the horizon of limitless economic growth, on which the 20th century democratic political imaginary was founded. So what the project's interested in then is the relationship between this loss of a hegemonic vision of future consumer society in our contemporary political moment. And I don't think we've collectively given enough thinking to this relationship between the crisis in expectations of consumer society and where we are politically. If once shared visions of the future offered by consumer society no longer hold, how do people imagine the future of consumption, and what are the political effects of that? What are the political implications of these imagined futures in the context of the collapse of promissory legitimacy of consumer society? So some literature just recently really has begun to explore how imagined futures become socially performative, generally in terms of how different actors mobilize imaginaries or imagined futures and how these are contested, for example, between social movements and business interests. Our research in this project's asking a prior question. It's looking at what imagined futures of consumption already exist among the public. And these, of course, obviously reflect traces of mobilizations and contestations from actors such as social movements, businesses, and so on. But we shouldn't conflate the two completely. They importantly represent pre-existing ground on which the political contests, the contestation between different imagined futures are played out. So in this project, we collaborated with the Mass Observation Project at the University of Sussex. Sounds much more sinister than it is. Mass observation came out of the documentary movement in Britain in the 1930s, documentary filmmaking and so forth. And it set out to record everyday life in Britain. Today, amongst other things, the Mass Observation Project has a volunteer panel, about 400 people, that provide open written responses to researchers' prompts and questions, which are known as directives. So 3 times a year, the volunteer panel receive directives, usually with 2 different projects in them. And then people can write what they want in response. And some people write a few lines, and some people write thousands and thousands and thousands of words. So this research follows in a tradition really of speculative essay writing that's been used by a number of studies to elicit individuals, usually young people's imaginative engagement with the future. It's a tradition in UK sociology. It really began with Ray Parle, sociologist that worked with young people on the Isle of Sheppey, which is a very underprivileged area in the south of England, look at their expectations for the future and then followed them over their lifetime to look at the relationship between those expectations and how people's lives have panned out. So Mass Observation Directive offers, as my colleague Vanessa May, who's also used mass observation, quote, the space and time to think about and develop their thoughts on a topic that's rather abstract and therefore rather difficult to investigate through interviews. So directives are ideally suited to elicit really rich, detailed responses about expectations of everyday life. And moreover, the volunteers are very aware, people writing, are very aware that they're writing for a historical archive. So mass observation data is very good at eliciting how people imagine themselves in history, how they embed themselves in a particular temporal context. So we had 118 responses. These were written between December 2018 and February 2019. So importantly, and I don't talk about this in this this presentation, but we can perhaps talk about this afterwards. This is before the pandemic. So in a sense, this is a historical document of pre-pandemic expectations, which obviously complicates the matter. It's important to acknowledge that the volunteer panel is not demographically representative, although Mass Observation do try in their recruitment to make it more demographically representative. But it's disproportionately older respondents, disproportionately women, educated, university educated. However, it's not homogenous by any means. So this is what the directive looks like. Well, this is the first part of our directive. This will carry on for another slide's worth of text. With the directive, you give a brief layperson's introduction to the research, and then a series of prompts and questions under different headings to prompt the volunteers to write. So this is very much not a survey. There's no obligation for them to respond to everything. People choose what to respond to. Some people are very systematic. Some people kind of take inspiration from one thing and run with that. So we've got things in here. I've highlighted a couple. Over the last 50 years, our expectations of normal consumption have changed considerably. Will expectations change as much again? Obviously, a challenge with this research was to get people to engage imaginatively with something as abstract as this, and to think about it over the long term. So another prompt down here: will things we take to be necessities and luxuries be the same in the future? To analyze this mass, so what you end up with from mass observation is an absolute huge mass of very, very unstructured data. So how to engage with this? So our starting point was Anne Mische, the American cultural sociologist, concept of dimensions of projectivity, by which she means variations in future orientation. And I was particularly inspired by Anne Mische's work on this. So the 2009 piece is a literature review, really, of social science and psychological studies of future orientation. And from all that, Mische suggests 9 different dimensions of projectivity. I won't go through all of these here. Working with our data and using coding for these, so we're coding for reproducibility between myself and Ulrika, and playing around with the codes, we found that we can make 4 of these work. Mische divides her dimensions of projectivity into what she calls cognitive contours on the one hand, and what she called action orientations on the other hand. We found that the 4 that we could make work were all action orientations, and we're still not sure really to what extent that's coincidental or to what extent that says something. That's something that we need to explore further. So the dimensions that we used to analyze the data are connectivity, which describes the degree to which an imagined logic of connection exists between present and future events. Expandability, which marks the degree to which we imagine future possibilities opening up or contracting. Volition, the sense of whether the future is moving towards us beyond our control, or whether we have the capacity to make the future ourselves, whether we have agency. And lastly, sociality, which marks the extent to which there's consideration of social relationships, there's articulation of the role of social actors and interaction in the particular articulation of the future. So what we wanted to achieve was identification of distinct imaginaries. So imaginaries defined here in our terms, or imagined futures, defined by configurations of, on the one hand, thematic content. So whether people are discussing technological trends or ecological constraints, or you know, talking about food or mobility or whatever, and dimensions of projectivity. So how those how distinct configurations of those two can be found. So in short, not just whether people are talking about, for example, ecological states, ecological constraints, excuse me, but the way in which they talk about ecological constraints, and whether that expresses distinct forms of orientation to the future. Do people see those ecological constraints as set in stone, coming towards them, unavoidable? Do they see them as something that can be engaged with politically and potentially overcome, for example? So we translated Mische's existing theory-based definitions into workable coding definitions. And we found that in order to do that, we needed to address each dimension of projectivity on a spectrum from high to low. So for example, low volition then is the sense of that the future is moving towards us beyond our control. High volition is a high sense of agency, a sense that we can make the future ourselves. And what we found in our data, I mean, we could do this, it worked. Excuse me for a moment, I have to sip of my cup of tea. And we found 3 distinct imaginaries, imagined futures. And it's probably worth pointing out then that in terms of the data, the individuals might have elements or indeed the entirety of more than one of these imaginaries. So these are discursive constructions across the data as a whole, but they're distinct configurations within the data rather than us simply looking for a scenario or a vision, if you like. So we could identify three distinct imaginaries, and notably the dominant imagined futures, and again this is pre-COVID-19, foresaw a coming future beyond the end of consumer society, framed by resource scarcity, framed by ecological crisis. And it's important to point out that the directive is very careful in the directive to avoid any reference whatsoever to climate change, to the environment. The word environment, the word sustainability is not in there at all, and make no gestures towards environmental crisis, climate change. So, I mean, firstly, this suggests that simply putting the association of consumption and future together is enough for most people to produce an ecological framing, around resource scarcity, ecological crisis, and so on. So we have these three imagined futures, two of which are about constrained consumption in the face of ecological limits, and there are positive and negative versions of those. So again, there might be the same thematic content, but different dimensions of projectivity, and that's what defines the difference between our imagined future of the frugal good life and the post-consumer society dystopia, which I'll talk about in a moment. The third and less dominant imaginary was one of technological innovation, of capitalist technological innovation. And I think it's important to point out there just how removed that imaginary is from a kind of modernist idea of technological progress. It's technological innovation and what that does, rather than a kind of modernist idea of social, technological, political progress all bound up together. So just briefly talk about our three futures then. So first of all, the frugal good life, or frugal futures, so this vision of positive constrained consumption. Climate change and ecological crisis then could militate towards a better world in this imagined future. So here people imagine more frugal lifestyles based on values of care and simplicity. The overconsumption of current consumer society, which many people are very critical of, simply won't be possible because of ecological constraints, because of resource constraints, and so on. So in a way, the amelioration of the negative effects of consumerism are forced upon people. But people expressed hope that a slower, calmer world, a world of far more modest appetites and expectations of everyday consumption may emerge, a frugal good life. So, and these are expressed in terms of, in individual terms, from kind of guarded optimism about this to quite utopian thinking about the possibilities. However, there's also equally in the data, we find an imaginary of negative constrained consumption. So this is a post-consumer society dystopia. Planetary, demographic, economic pressures here are seen to lead to future collapse. So this is a scenario that we're really, very used to in popular culture, perhaps starting to be used to politically as well, in which the comforts and conveniences of current consumer society are no longer possible. So this is a future of limited access to resources, limited access to consumer goods, of material discomfort for the majority, of economic inequality. So there's a strong sense of a tiny elite doing all right while everybody else suffers the consequences. And so these imagined futures range from dystopian to really apocalyptic imaginations of what the future of consumption would look like, what the future more broadly would look like. So techno-futures, technological innovation. Notably, as I say, this is not technological progress. Rather, it's more commonly understood in terms of profound disruptive change through technological trends. And we don't divide this into a negative and positive version because we don't find in the data distinct dimensions of projectivity that allow us to do that. So within this imaginary, there are positive and negative appraisals of it, but it's not expressed in terms of distinct dimensions of projectivity. So for some people, this represents exciting possibilities, all sorts of new forms of leisure, even in the more utopian forms of community. For others, it's a world of technological unemployment, or kind of hyper-individualism, of alienation. But as I say, these are not expressed in terms of different dimensions of projectivity. So I won't go through all this. It's a very busy slide. I won't go through the whole thing. But the slide shows how the imaginaries are distinct at the level of dimensions of projectivity. I just want to pick out a few points that I think are salient, and particularly salient to think about what we might call the politics of expectations. So what's surprising? I mean, things that surprised us, things that we weren't expecting to find, which is always nice, obviously, in data. So firstly, in our frugal future good life, so what most of us would probably want to see happen, hope for the future. Noticeably then, there's low connectivity. So present, transition and future are not clearly distinguished. People found it very difficult, it seemed, to imagine the transition. So people often, in the context of this, would talk about their present consumption behaviours, more sustainable or ethical consumption behaviours, and how they might relate to the future. But there's very limited differentiation between present, transition and future. And that contrasts very much with the Techno-Futures, techno-innovation imaginary, in which there's very clear connectivity, a very clear sense of how technological trends will lead to inflection points, disruptive moments where there will be social, socio-economic, socio-technical reconfiguration. So I think that's an interesting point to start with. There's also, and this is perhaps the most surprising to us, low sociality. So there's a lack of contextualization of everyday social life in the future. So we find a lot of critical stances towards consumerism when people are talking about this. But generally people defaulted to a kind of very sort of the kind of framing of consumption that most of us would be very critical of, theoretically, of an aggregation of individual consumer choices in the marketplace, or perhaps at most an aggregation of individual actions that might be mobilized politically in some way, but very little sense of social relations and how they might work in this imagined future. Yeah, so sociality here is sort of limited to a collective of independent actions of individuals, rather than a sense of what the key social actors here are, what social relationships might be like in the future. I think they're the kind of standout things for me that differ from our expectations, and I think obviously that says something about the political moment that we're in that people find it very, very difficult to imagine social change in a positive way towards the frugal future good life, the only positive, the only clearly positive future here. There are positive versions of the techno-future or technological innovation. whereas people within the Techno-Futures imaginary, there is high connectivity, and there's also high sociality. So people find it quite easy to imagine everyday life reorganized by socio-technical change. So again, I think that represents something about the moment that we're in. It clearly reflects the availability of cultural repertoires to people. We're quite saturated culturally in technological versions of the future. There are prominent discourses in the public sphere, in media, about automation, digitisation, AI, technological unemployment, and so on, in a way that there aren't such prominent discourses that might relate to non-technical transitions, so socio-economic transitions that we might see with our frugal future good life. So I'm interested in what the political implications of these imaginaries might be. As I said at the beginning, I see this as the ground on which the more sort of formalized imagined futures expressed by social movements or businesses or political parties or whatever, this is the ground on which those can be mobilized, on which they're contested. And obviously there's a complicated relationship between the two. And I come from a practice theoretical understanding of consumption. So just briefly to say something about how we might relate practices to these imagined futures. Obviously the kind of data that we've got, it's very difficult to do that. But frugal futures most clearly integrated into sets of practices. And this is really because people, a lot of the time when people are talking about the imagined future of frugal futures, they're talking about ethical and sustainable consumption practices in the here and now. So they're talking about practices that they're already engaged in. But obviously, an interest of the project is the motivational potential, the sense in which people have a sense of agency over their relationship to the future that are carried in particular practices. So we can see with frugal futures then that there is a distinct set of practices in the here and now that this imagined future is carried in, that people do engage in their ethical and sustainable consumption practices with an orientation towards the possibility of these practices in the future, as well as their realization in the present. So to what extent actors believe they can positively shape their future is essential for understanding this motivational function, and we find that then in our terms in the dimension of high volition, and the dimension of volition at the high end of the scale. But as I say, with frugal futures, we also find low connectivity. Past, the transition and future are not clearly distinguished, and we find a lack of contextualization of everyday life, of social life in the future. And I think there are two different kind of competing, maybe complementary, I'm not sure, ways in which we could interpret that. People tended, when talking about frugal futures, to look to the past. And part of the reason for this is undoubtedly the age of most of our respondents. So mass observation is skewed towards older, the volunteer panels skewed towards older cohorts. Our data, for one reason or another, is even more skewed towards older age groups. So the majority of the people writing for us could actually remember a much more frugal society. Many of them would be able to remember immediately post-war society. And And of course, on an individual level, many of them are looking back to their childhoods, which might condition how they think about this as well. Bauman has a negative appraisal of the idea of retrotopia. And of course, we tend to associate that sort of looking backwards to conservative political impulses. So in the UK at the moment, we might associate that sort of with Brexit and nostalgic ideas of how Britain was an empire and so forth. We don't really find that in the data, but if one was being critical of the frugal future, one could perhaps see it as a retrotopia. People imagine much more localized, much simpler life. Equally, you could see it in terms of prefigurative politics, in the sense that while people find it difficult to express the difference between the present, the future, and the transition, people are embodying, and people actively see themselves as embodying, engaging in practices of ethical consumption or sustainability, sustainable consumption, which are prefigurative of the utopian possibilities of a world in which a positive post-consumer society world. Okay, I think I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. What a wonderful and inspiring presentation. I know I have plenty of questions, but I'm going to open the floor. And what great images you're leaving with us here. Yes, a big round of applause from everyone. There are already some questions that have come up in the chat, actually. So maybe, Anna, did you want to go first, or should I read your question off?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. Thanks, Marlena. Yeah, really interesting, Dan, and just very nice to have that body of data with all the restrictions and constraints that you had, but having access to it's fascinating. I love the idea of the direction and prompt. We were trying to do similarly with young people with our flash fiction, responding to a visual prompt in a similar way. That's really interesting. I just wonder, this is back to the kind of theoretical frame that you were presented, that you used to analyze the data. So I had a question about where and if matters of emotion in that, because it's a lot of action orientation and cognition, but then, you know, from the analysis it was like positive and negative, and I just wondered how much of that was what you gleaned from the data, or what you are kind of imposing on the data as positive and negative, and kind of positive and negative for whom. So just based on your last kind of discussion around this potential between, was it retrotopia and kind of prefigurative politics, I wonder how much of that is dependent on the person that's writing these kinds of responses. And I guess this is a limitation of the data, is that I guess you can't follow up to kind of probe any of these elements. But that's my first question. It's just, where does affect or emotion kind of come into the data, and how do you kind of account for that?
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think, well, in terms of, so to take that apart a bit, then is it our framing, or is it in the data? I would say it's in the data. I mean, people are quite emotive in this data. I mean, people are expressing emotion, intimately bound up a lot of the time with what people are talking about. There's, you know, I mean, as I say, there's quite, you know, there's a strong thread throughout the data of, you know, on a spectrum of sort of concern to disgust, really, about contemporary consumer society and culture. People talk about, you know, throwaway culture, and people are very concerned about waste and so forth. I do think, I mean, I think in order to get a sort of broader sense of what's going on here, we would need to do the same thing with much younger people, because I do think that it's heavily, and we don't have enough of a age spectrum within the data. I mean, we tried to look to see, I mean, it's really heavily skewed to older people. I mean, I think our average age is like 60 or something, and the you know, we tried to see, you know, do people under 50 express things differently or so, and we couldn't find that in the data. My guess is if we asked 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds, we might find something quite different. Not that 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds are necessarily happy with the state of consumer society, but I think the difference for this this cohort, as I say, is that people within their own biographies can remember a quite different way of living, a much more constrained way of living, and not universally, but often people are, you know, sort of emotionally positive about that as well. So to a certain extent, some of this might be slightly coloured by rosy memories of childhood, you know. So it is in the data. There is a lot of affect in the data. There's a lot of emotion in the data. You know, people are expressing hopes and fears. People are many, as I say, given the age group, you know, most of these people have children or grandchildren. You know, lots of people are expressing real concern for the world in which their grandchildren, their children are growing up. So yeah, I think, you know, it's there, and it's certainly it's a very important part of. I don't think we can sort of separate it out really from.
Yeah, no, that's what I expected. I mean, I guess it's that the framework doesn't seem to be explicitly capturing that, and then you have the kind of positive and negative. So it's your coding of the kind of feelings towards these kinds of elements that you've done in the analysis, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I think what that, yes, sorry, I haven't really answered that point properly, have I? I think what that reflects is that there's that's a really good point, actually. I mean, I have to go back to the data to think about this, more fully. But my immediate thought with that is that at least some of the different ways in which the dimensions are expressed map onto different emotional registers. So if people are talking about, if people have a high sense of volition, then people have a high sense of agency, of political possibility, and so forth, and people are expressing hope. If there's low volition, people see the future as coming towards them. People see very little personal agency. They see lack of political agency, and so on. Then the emotional register that's generally associated with is despair, fear, concern. You know, so I think that's why it's in the data rather than us just looking at it and going, oh, this is positive, this is negative. I think it is there at that level, but it's a very good point, and it's not something that kind of systematically addressed. But that the hope, you know, I suppose the hope despair register is the one which enables us to make that difference, and that's why we can't do it with technological innovation. There isn't that people, you know, individuals express, and different discursive elements, you know, express and have negative and positive appraisals of different technological trends, but it doesn't map on in the data in such a way that we can say, here is a positive techno-future, here's a negative techno-future.
Great, thank you.
Dan, there are a number of hands that have gone up,
sure.
So I think we have to move quite swiftly now through the Q&A. How should we do this? Should I take two at a time? Is that manageable?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll try and answer two at a time.
So I'll give the floor to Lenneke and Charlotte.
Thank you, Marlene. Yeah, I want to be quick then, I guess. So one question I had is, can I take from your data that there seems to be a gap for frugal good life futures to filling them out? Just a question. And also, yeah, I agree that I think younger generations, and especially the students I teach in the technical university, I feel they have quite a different and quite still a techno-optimist kind of image of the future. So I was wondering, yeah, are you planning any future research on these kind of groups, or do you know of any that's going to happen?
Yeah.
And I had a very short methodological question. You said that there was nothing on sustainability in the brief, but so there was also not your affiliation of the Sustainable Consumption Institute anywhere for the participants?
No, it's a good point. No, I'm pretty sure not. No, it's just University of Manchester. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good to know.
That was right. Sorry, carry on.
Charlotte.
Thanks. And thank you, Dan. It was really, really interesting. Really great. I just wanted to tell you that I was so fascinated by the three kind of categories of imagined futures that you saw in your data. And interestingly, when I did the workshop on kind of a future travel workshop with quite young people in the age of 20, 25, they had we did a workshop with 3 rounds where the first future travel was kind of a baseline travel where the students were asked to imagine a sustainable future. So sustainability was a prompt in that sense, but they had quite similar projections of their future, but in a way collated into one, because they had this focus on community and frugalness actually, and doing things collectively and very locally. But everything was also organized by some kind of invisible technological magic. They didn't really exemplify what type of technology it was and who decided how the technology should order society. But technology was definitely there to kind of decide who should get what, which was really interesting. But then actually they progressed, because we did several other future travels, and we did some introductory stuff for some of them where we highlighted some of the issues of today and today's consumption. And then the futures became a lot more fragmented, less technological, more frugal, but also a lot more tense, not dystopian, but very radically different, which was interesting. So I just wanted I just wanted to say that we saw some of the same overall categories in a completely different type of workshop and methodology. So that's pretty interesting, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks both. So quick response to Lenneke then. Yeah, the gap with the frugal good life. Yeah, I mean, I think that clearly there's a clear lesson from this data that at least our respondents struggled to imagine social change, and there's a very limited sense of socio-economic change, and the models. So I mean, that's why I'd sort of point to retrotopia, because the models that people could point to, or the visions that people could point to, were really looking into the past of how things were of before consumer sort of intensification of consumer society, and that contrasts with their ability to imagine socio-technical change. So while people were quite capable of imagining how technological trends would profoundly reconfigure society, people really struggle to imagine socio-economic change. And I think, I mean, in a way that's not surprising, but that obviously speaks to a political moment where that we're in at the moment, where there is a lack of mainstream discourses of positive social and socio-economic change, which are plausible and that people buy into. On the young people thing, I mean, I'd love to, I sort of have to hold my hands up at this point and say that this project was massively knocked off course by the pandemic. I had absolutely all sorts of plans over the last couple of years, all of which got blown out of the water. And one of the things that I wanted to do was a similar thing with young people. I'm just about to run out of funding on it, which is problematic. So I'm going to have to work out how to do that in other ways. But maybe by talking to your students, Lenica, that might be the way to do it. I mean, I think at some point we had an exchange about possibly doing the essay exercise with your students, and that would be really interesting to analyze it with the same data. And I think, you know, I mean, Charlotte, you talk about the workshop. I think a number of people here have really interesting data. And one of the things that I need to do is engage now. It's kind of take stock and engage with other people's work and have conversations with other people and see how sort of, you know, maybe collectively we can draw some of these things together. And I am just about to start, I should say, a project with colleagues at CIFO Consumption Research Norway on imagined futures of sustainability, which will allow a continuation of some of this work. So that's an exciting possibility. I think with the workshops, Charlotte, your workshops, yes, I mean, maybe it's an age, I mean, maybe, you know, I think there probably is a really major age effect going on here, and young people's, you know, the people that are writing essays for mass observation are much more likely to feel quite alienated by the contemporary technological society, rather than see, you know, embedded within it or see sort of future benefits of it. I think I'll leave my responses there.
Great, thank you. I'm actually going to put my hand up as well so I get in line. But now I'll give the floor to Jaco and Mary, if you can both ask your questions, and then Claire and I will ask our questions, if that's okay. Go ahead, Jaco, you can go first.
Yeah, right. Thanks for a very interesting presentation then, and very interesting work. And say, having heard your presentation, I couldn't help noticing that, say, well, overseeing quite some period of this kind of work, and what are the imaginations, what are like the main future themes, then I couldn't help noticing quite some continuity. So, and most of the work that you do is done in this direction. There's always like a techno-optimist view or future. There will also always be, well, voluntary simplicity or a degrowth-oriented one, and there will always be like a collapse or a pessimistic one. So you could argue that there is quite some continuity in the imaginaries of people. And I would like to hear your reflection, what we can learn from that, but what that then also means to put it into practice or into policy making. And I was also wondering, maybe I missed that, whether you had done anything, say, to relate, say the imaginaries to numbers or preferences. And normally you won't see that there's an equal division. This is then constructed as very distinct future views, what you can find in the sample, but maybe you can say something on that. And I also wanted to say a little thing on the social change, or the lack of the social change capacity to imagine. My personal experience is that when you do it at the survey level or the personal level, it's not so easy. But when you put people in a group, it's say you get a kind of creativity by association, and you can get much more. And then you will find out that there are many ideas, but you're not so easy to get. It requires a bit of a process. And maybe you can also say something on that. Actually, I see in the chat that Lendik is also referring to that, that as a next challenge. But then I think now first to Mary and then to you.
Yes, first to Mary and then back to Dan. Exactly. Thank you for being so efficient.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for your talk, Dan. Very interesting and inspiring. Yeah, just to follow on the theme of continuity, it's interesting because my work has looked backwards over people's lives biographically, and very similar themes come out around imaginations of the future or the present, which was the future at certain points in people's lives, and how that directs their action. But yeah, I was struck by something you said in relation to methodology, a methodological question. So you say that the type of data that you have there around kind of these essays that perhaps they're not the best for accessing practice futures, but more. So I was wondering, could you comment a little bit about around the relationship between imaginaries and actual practices, and the methodological question of how do we access future practices, I guess, in methodology? What type of methods beyond, I guess, these type of writings might we be able to use? And I know there's others here also looking at practice futures, so maybe that's a question for more broadly, what type of methods we can use to access practices, and to what extent imaginaries enable us to access practices. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks both. Okay. Okay, where to start with that? So, Jaco, yeah, I mean, these clearly do, you know, the three clearly do represent culturally available repertoires. I think, I mean, so I'm interested in, I guess I'm interested in the politics of it, and the potential for imagined futures, for visions of social change to be performative, the possibility for mobilization and so forth. And you know, there is work on this. I think it says something about, and again, I mean, it's, you know, there is this confounding factor here in this data of the age cohort effect. But I think the key thing for me is this point of a dislocation. There's very much a dislocation between the technological futures and the frugal good life. So there's very little, there's where there's hope or optimism about the technological futures, it's, you know, it's hope and optimism about specific technological trends that, you know, that digitization might enable us to to have little robots running about delivering things for us and so on, rather than make us all unemployed. But there's no real connect. There's no connect between that and a sort of ecological or environmental vision. And at the same time, the frugal future vision, the ecological vision, it is almost completely devoid of technology, really. You know, I mean, it's quite, I mean, that's very noticeable in the data. You know, I mean, sometimes people say things like, you know, oh, maybe we'll all have our own solar panels, you know, but I mean, it's kind of at that level. There's no, you know, there's no link up there. And I kind of think that's important, because I think I think acknowledging the disparity between people's capacity to imagine socio-technical change and socio-economic change is really important. So that's just a comment, really, in response to that. On the numbers thing, if I got your question right, I think you're asking, how do we know that one's more dominant than the other? So I don't have them to hand. I mean, I do have somewhere, you know, lists of literally numbers of discursive incidences of different coding, and it's from that we could say the positive and negative constrained consumption futures are more dominant than the technological futures. It's complicated, of course, by the fact that we're not looking at individuals. So it's not a case of saying, 75 people have this imaginary and 20 people have another imaginary, which, from a discourse analysis point of view, I think is justified, but does sort of complicate things as well. And on your point about group work and focus groups, yes, I mean, I'm sure, and I know you've done a lot of work in this area, and it's something that I'd be interested to do in the future, know a bit more about what you and other people have done with this, because clearly that's a way of eliciting different kind of engagement in futures thinking. Mary's point on the relationship between practices and imaginaries. So I think there's 2 points. So I think there's a theoretical point about how we link the two up, and there's a methodological point. I think on the methodological point, other people here are probably better qualified than me to talk about how to think about future practices. And I mean, and think of Anna's project, other projects of people here where you sort of creatively engaging in that. So I don't think I'm the best person really from this work, certainly, to answer that. On the theoretical side, I mean, I do have an answer which I haven't foregrounded in the presentation because it's a bit dry. But I mean, I see, so coming from a practice theoretical point of view, for me, the imagined futures operate in terms of teleoeffectivity. They operate in terms of their capacity to organize or orchestrate practices, alignment towards particular ends, and to configure groups of practices to align towards particular ends. And obviously they relate to the motivational and effective engagement in those. So, I mean, in earlier work, I did some works on an idea of teleoeffective formation, which is developed from Shatsky's idea of teleoeffective regime, which is to think about multiple practices and how multiple practices, which I think is generally lacking in practice theory work, to think about how sets of practices are configured around particular discourses and particular effective orientations. And there was always a sense in that work that the future orientation, I mean, certainly from Shatsky's understanding of practices, is very teleological, of course. So there's always within that a sense of future orientation. And what I wanted to do with this work was to make that much more explicit, and to take the future orientation as the starting point, if you like, work back from that. So you can, if you were to take individual practices that people are talking about, you can see within the data how the future is embedded within those practices, if you like, to a greater or lesser extent. And again, with the frugal futures, people talking about ethical, sustainable consumption, it is in a prefigurative sense. So it's generally people talking about doing something which people see it as, as we all do, I suppose. People see it as both, a minor aggregated contribution to the social good, and potentially the embodiment of how you might do things in the future. It's much more difficult to see that with the technological, the technological, people talking about technological practices, which is not to say, or more technologically orientated practices, which is not to say that there is no sense of future orientation in those practices. I mean, on a obvious level, some of the time people are engaging in practices which they see as nascent, or practices which are going to become more, or versions of practices which are going to become much more dominant because of technology. But again, I think, you know, in terms of my own work and thinking through this, I think other people have done, CIFO's done some really interesting work around digital technology in everyday life, and some aspects of how that's orientated to the future. And I think for my own work, what I need to do is sit back and do a big literature survey of all the stuff that I would have liked to have read over the last couple of years, but haven't had a chance to. And I'll probably hopefully find the answers in relating my stuff to other people's stuff.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think it's fascinating because some of the imaginaries of the future actually have elements of going back to the past in them. So it's like the degree of future orientation, or, you know, the kind of ideology of the future that comes through. Yeah, they're kind of linked to different, I guess, space times in terms of that.
And I think particularly, I mean, we actually had one disappointment. I mean, I was very pleased with the way that this data panned out, the data and the methodology with it panned out, except one thing, which was we actually had a question there about Brexit as well, because this was 2019, 2018, 2019, so it's relatively fresh in people's minds. And part of the reason to put Brexit in there was sort of to elicit something around whether progressive visions or visions looking backwards, you know, obviously Brexit, you know, political discourse around Brexit is, you know, really fundamentally nostalgic and orientated back to this ridiculous imagined past of, you know, rosy very white rural 1950s, you know, that empire sort of, you know, is there, but, you know, isn't problematic in any way and so forth. But unfortunately, there just wasn't enough in the data from the Brexit material for us to do anything interesting with it. I was hoping that there might even capture some people having a you know, a positive future orientated vision of how Brexit was going to revolutionise things. There were two traces of that in the political discourse. There wasn't around Brexit. There wasn't very much. And of course, most of it actually harked back to a kind of 19th century free trade idea where there'd be a rosy future of cheap food because we'd get rid of all of our ridiculous subsidies around sustainability and stuff, and we could all just enjoy cheap food from the rest of the world. That's about as far as it went. But yeah, I think that, you know, that the relation between nostalgia and future orientation, I think is pretty critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for the hardcore future lovers that are still here, we have two more questions, Claire and then myself. So I guess the two co-chairs will conclude, and maybe Claire, we could say something quickly also about the talks planned in 2022 that we'll be announcing over email as well.
Yeah, I noticed Jacko just escaped. I was going to ask him to introduce his talk, but I'll have to go through that abstract now. Thank you, Dan. It was so interesting to hear a bit more about this work. I've tried to hear you talk about it numerous times and missed you at every opportunity, I think. So it was nice to finally get a chance to hear about it. I've kind of come from a more engineering and scientific scenario side of things, and the critical literature there is, you know, it really pushes the fact that in the science and engineering scenarios and modeling scenarios, there's always these very polemic views of like utopia, dystopia, or technophilic, technophobic, community-led versus state-led change, and these sorts of polemic views that sort of resist representing more complex visions of the future. And some of the solutions that's put forward by that critical literature are like, ask people, use qualitative methods, and add granularity. And I thought it was really interesting. So I've always been a bit suspicious of those solutions because I think it sort of excuses science and engineering from trying a bit harder. And instead what you're essentially asking is the public to populate visions on behalf of scientists. And I can see why we would do that, but I can also see why it's not necessarily the be all and end all. I think it's interesting then that the sort of three futures that you found in a way are quite similar. And I think Jacko made the same point, Mary's made similar. Yeah. See these similar tropes coming out actually in those scenarios. But I wondered whether in the data that you've got, so you've asked broad questions about the future, but also prompted on certain things. So there was shopping, there was travel, there was food, there was a couple of other very specific prompts. And I wondered whether you'd done any comparison between those more, and I realize like maybe not all of them have gone into that level of detail, but if you can compare some of the more granular reflections on what the future of, for example, food might be like, to those more top level visions of what the future might be like, whether it starts to present a slightly more, I don't know, gritty picture, perhaps, if not more nuanced.
Yeah, thanks for that, Claire. I mean, part of what I wanted to do with the project, and this is again, you know, being honest, holding my hands up and saying how much the pandemic knocked it off course. What I haven't got to do in the project, which I wanted to do, was to then take this and think through what is the relationship then between this kind of exercise and this kind of data and the kind of thing that futurists, forecasters do, scenario planning and so forth. And hopefully I'll still get the opportunity to do this in one way or another, perhaps in collaboration with CIFO in the new project. Because part of the motivation was that, I mean, I have one or two links with the sort of commercial futurist world, and you know, it's very interesting, and I'm interested in you know, previous work in my PhD work, I did work on sustainability communications. I'm interested in the role of you know, what sociology which you might refer to as cultural intermediaries, the role of professional groups who are often normatively, quite normatively driven, and the role that they play as intermediaries between different stakeholders in society. So what I would really like to do, and I don't know if I will be able to, because my funding is ticking down, is to take this data and engage with professional futurists with it. How to do that is challenging. One idea was to commission some kind of art work, which would be a kind of centerpiece for doing that. So maybe some sort of data visualization thing. And obviously with the futurists, I mean, I'm certainly not dismissive of the kind of stuff that they do. Obviously it tends to be technologically dominated. And so, you know, a big motivation there was to bring, you know, as to say, these are the tools and understandings of social science and sociology of consumption specifically, and you know, and what can they add to the kind of work that you do, and perhaps add, you know, some sort of nuances in some ways and open up the possibilities. Because part of my interest in this whole thing actually came originally from my PhD work, wherein looking at sustainability communications, I was also coming across, you know, imagined futures, you know, imagined sustainable futures scenarios, whatever, cooked up by futurists and sustainability communication people for companies usually, and interested in the role that these things play. They sometimes get reasonable amount of traction in the media. And obviously there's you know, when people are imagining the future, they're drawing on a cultural repertoire, which, you know, largely obviously is coming from media, from stuff in the public sphere. So there's a very interesting set of relationships going on there. In response to your other point about the granularity about the practices, it's a really good point, and we to be honest, I'm struggling to remember how far we got with it. I mean, we did try to do that. and it's possible that it's possible that it's something that could go back to and look at in the data and see if there's anything there. It was quite, I mean, in our initial attempts to do it, we didn't get very far, which may have been a function from memory. It's quite a long time ago that we were actually doing the analysis now. May have been a function of the data just not being rich enough on different types of practices. In terms of the prompts and stuff, because I did want people to talk about consumption in a way which would be understandable in a practice theoretical way. I wanted, obviously, but without having to convey practice theory to people in one side of A4. So the focus on those specific things, to think about mobility, to think about food, to think about clothing and so on, was to try and prompt people towards thinking about particular consumption domain related practices. Because I mean, I think it's a really good point that in the same way in which sustainability and the possibilities for sustainability are very variegated in the way that they're integrated into different consumption domains, I think that's probably true of future visions as well. That people find it much more easy to imagine what a future of sustainable food is than a future of sustainable whatever. So it's maybe something that I could go back to. We didn't get very far with it, and that may be that the data is just not good enough really to do it.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear about.
Great. So I guess I have the last question. I just wanted to say, Dan, the presentation was really wonderful, and your work is very inspiring, I think, to people who are sort of trying to discover, as I am with Orlan, trying to sort of find our way in this world of social futures. And I just wanted to react to the images that you showed, especially of this future kitchen. I use a similar image in my work of the French Salon des Arts Ménagers, which was a way to sort of make appliances more than appliances, but about artful living in a way, and how feminists in the 1950s were actually really behind this idea of the kitchen. And the reason I just, I've used that image to talk about emotions and how there are sort of the explicit emotions of pride and modernism and technological prowess and all these things, and sort of very implicit emotions of shame, or if you don't have this kind of kitchen, you're no longer a good citizen in a way. But in hearing you this time, I was thinking of the sociology of expectations, and this is where my question is going, and how the future is not about projecting, but it is about understanding how certain representations of the future open possibilities today, or say something about power dynamics today. And I just, I look at those pictures and I think, why are we not doing more as a community to have other representations of non-consumerist futures? And it goes to what everyone's, been discussing. But so now I have a very self-serving question, because we're trying to write a conceptual framework with Orlan for this paper on social futures. And I do understand what has emerged in cultural sociology and Mische's work and how she draws from American pragmatists. But where is the sociology of expectations emerging from? I know it's in the STS community, but are these two communities linked? Did they just happen to emerge at the same time in different academic spaces, as is often the case? I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I was just trying to figure out how these two worlds, sociology of expectations and the more cultural approach to futures, have sort of emerged in parallel, let's say.
From what I understand of it, it is pretty in parallel. I mean, Mische, so in that 2009 article where the dimensions are from, that's a very impressive piece of literature survey, really, and then conceptual development from it. And sociology of expectations is in there. She's looked at everything really, so social scientifically that's engaged with futures. My understanding is that they're pretty much in parallel rather than in communication. so as you say, in Sociology of Expectations, I think there's very interesting work in there, you know, emerged really sort of around the turn of the millennium, I think, and then you know, the inheritance of that is like work from Sheila Yazanoff and colleagues, I don't think there's very much dialogue between them, really. I mean, I think the problematics that drive, I think what they're fundamentally interested in, and I think the problematics that drive the two are quite different. Mische is coming from a background of looking at social movements and American, as you say, American pragmatism and American cultural sociology. Very much not, I mean, despite the pragmatism element there, very much individually focused though. I mean, it's not a practice theoretical thing. Although, you know, she's just done discourse analysis, not on an individual level, looking at political statements and so on. So yeah, I think they're kind of in parallel. And I mean, I suppose increasingly you see, because there is this burgeoning interest in social futures. So, you know, increasingly one does see, you know, these things cited together as sort of potential resources, but I don't think there's much dialogue between them. I mean, interestingly, Anne Mische, in the 2014 article, she and her team, they've got a book coming out anytime now, which I'm very interested to see. But interestingly, they found that they couldn't actually make the dimensions work in their data. So they went off on a rather different tangent. And at some point it'd be quite need to sit down and sort of look at what we did and look at what they did and why it's different, and so forth. But yeah, I think they're parallel developments, but they're I mean, there's a lot in, you know, there's a wealth of stuff in sociology of expectations, certainly. And I mean, on the images thing, I mean, I agree. I just think, you know, this part of the motivation to engage in this area is we just, you know, we need more culturally. We need more. We need more positive images of the future that can,
and varied
and socially mobilize. And and I think it's, and I just, you know, an original motivation for the project, which is why I begin with the history of consumer society, is that I just don't think we've done it collectively. I don't think we've done enough thinking about this point, this really fundamental point that the promissory authority of consumer societies just completely collapsed. Post financial crisis, it's completely collapsed. And to me, the politics of populism and Brexit and Trump, and so I don't think you can, you know, you've got to understand that in the context of the collapse of a really hegemonic, you know, contested certainly and variegated and so on, but you know, a culturally hegemonic version of what the future is.
They were so good at that. They were so good at creating that hegemony. I see that time is ticking, and I have two ideas that I wanted to throw out to the group. One is, why don't we invite Anne Mische to present her book to this?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Or invite her to the midterm meeting of the European Sociological Association, but make that talk open to this audience. And then I have another idea. Charlotte isn't here anymore, but wouldn't it be cool if we organize some kind of a mass flash fiction writing exercise where all of us spend 20 minutes writing a fictional future?
That'd be a lot of fun.
It would be fun, wouldn't it? And collecting these stories from different parts of the world as well. So I'm ending the year with this idea, and I don't know how you think about it.
Well, I think that would be a lot of fun. I mean, I haven't published this stuff yet, and I wanted to be in touch with, I don't know Anne Mische, but I wanted to be in touch with her before I published it, just to sort of touch base and say, look, we've done this with your work, and have you got any comments on it before? So, I mean, I'd be very happy as part and parcel of that to start some dialogue between
Yeah.
This group and potentially the consumption network. Yeah, and it'd be very interesting to see what they've come up with. She's got a whole team of people working on something, but I don't know quite what it is.
Exciting. Great. Exciting. And we do have 2 talks coming up. Claire, did you want to remind us? Claire's going to be taking the lead on those 2.
So currently people will have the wrong date in their diary of the 2nd of February. It's going to move to the 9th of February, but I'll send the full details out when we send the link to Dan's recording. That'll be Jaco talking to us about visions and visioning for sustainable consumption and sustainable lifestyles. So that will be on the 9th of February at 12:30 till 2. Sorry, I've written till 4 in my notes, but obviously we're not going to meet for 3.5 hours. So 12:30 till 2 Central European time. And then at the end of April, we'll, again, I'll send the precise dates and times around nearer the time. We'll hear from Stephen McGreevy and Max Spiegelberg. I think that's how we'd say his surname. They're yet to confirm the details of their talk, but I believe it's around food consumption during the pandemic. I also had an idea, Marlene, so with the Everyday Futures in a Pandemic special issue that Mary's been leading and all the papers sort of emerging from that, perhaps it would be nice to have a session with some sort of flash talks from some of the teams involved. I think it was about 70% of our audience today have been involved in some way in that special issue, and perhaps everybody else has been doing research at the same time. We could have some sort of little mini jam.
Yes, yeah.
Those sorts of pandemics and sustainable futures chat, sustainable consumption.
I'd be really interested to hear what you've all been up to with that. I mean, this has been a really great, for me, a really great group of people to present to. And as I say, you know, one big thing that I've got to do now is go off and read what everybody else has been doing properly for the last couple of years, because I think I'm a bit behind.
Lenneke, did you want to jump in quickly? Lenneke, your hand was up.
Yeah, this is along the same line. So previously I told you about this role play exercise that I've developed, and I'm happy to share it, but I think it would be more useful if it's experienced first, because it's when on paper it's not. So maybe within the context of this group, or as like an annex to it, I would like to offer kind of workshop, I guess. 1.5 or 2 hours would be enough to really experience that exercise. So partly it's a lot of fun to do this role play stuff. And then it would be really interesting also for me to hear your reflections on the exercise and what kind of role it can play in this imagining futures, because it's definitely in that realm.
I love it, and I took note, and I think Charlotte also has a great workshop around future travel, which we did yesterday with Lenneke.
Yes, I was going to say we did.
Wonderful. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
So I know people have to leave. It's 11:30. We have so many good things planned for next year. Really looking forward to seeing you all next year, and have a very safe, happy, healthy end of the year. Thanks for being part of this group. Thank you so much, Dan, for your wonderful
Well, thank you, everyone.
And see you all in 2022. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Oriane, I'm adding you to the list. Oh, she's gone already. Okay. Bye, Lenneke. Thanks so much, Dan.
Bye, Lenneke. I'll be in touch really soon, by the way.
Looking
well, I'll be
forward.
in touch with you both really soon. I've got to rush off now. But
Okay.
thanks for organising.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Solidarity with your strike. Bye.
Thanks, Marlene. Cheers. Bye-bye.